consolidates highway programs, national freight programs, any number of things. We can agree. It's not perfect, but it's the best we can do, and the American people deserve it. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman from Pennsylvania is recognized.
I yield myself as much time as I consume.
The gentleman is recognized.
I appreciate the passion from the gentleman from Virginia, and I believe he is a supporter of infrastructure, as am I, and I think you were referring to the former chairman. I just was on emailing back and forth to him. He sees much agreement with what we're trying to do in the House. He sees the need for reform, and as I've been going through this process, I certainly talked to him about some of the things he wished he would have been able to accomplish, and what we're doing in this bill are things he's applauding. So for any of you don't realize that the chairman's still alive and well, and still consults with his member of Congress when I ask and when I don't ask, I might add. Again, I have to remind my colleagues, be respectful when I do this, but when you had the majority, 6 times you extended without passing a bill, and you had a majority in the House, in the Senate, in the White House, and I might add that if you would have focused the stimulus bill on a infrastructure bill instead of spending it in all different ways that didn't have the kind of impact that you thought, and in fact didn't have much of an impact at all, I think we would see a much different economy today if we would have focused on this, because I know there are jobs out there, millions of jobs in construction and construction-related businesses where we could help by passing a bill. And again, just to remind my colleagues, the House and the Senate chairman and vice chairman have issued a statement. We are moving in the right direction towards a bipartisan, bicameral solution, not just a Senate solution. And again, I know that the 2 gentlemen, the whip and of course Mr. Moran for Virginia, have been great defenders of the House. For us to just give in to the Senate, I don't think I've ever seen them when they were in the majority just handing it off to the Senate. So I feel positive. Again, I supported Mr. Wall's motion to instruct a few days ago because he said, get in there, hammer this thing out, come up with a bipartisan, bicameral bill. That's why I supported that. Again, on this, I just can't find it to be able to support this. I've got to vote against it and urge my colleagues to vote no also. And with that, I yield back my time.
The gentleman reserves his time. The gentleman from Maryland.
Mr. Speaker, I yield myself such time as I may consume.
The gentleman is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I am a supporter of this institution. I am a supporter, as Mr. Schuster pointed out, of regular order. I do believe that the House has a right and a duty and a responsibility to maintain its positions when it can get to a position. Let me reiterate so the American people understand. Speaker Boehner said that the highway bill was very important to him. He wanted to see it reported out. The committee acted on a bill and never brought it to the floor. I pause so the American people can understand the House has been unable to take a position. Now, my friend will say, oh, no, we did pass a bill, and that's correct. Admittedly, however, from everybody's perspective, it was not a full bill. It was a shell bill. It was a shell bill to go to conference. Did it have some provisions in there? Yes, it did. It had Keystone in there, which was clearly unacceptable to the President in the form that it was offered and unacceptable to the Senate in the form that it was offered. Very frankly, my friend from Pennsylvania talks about his dad, who I know is very much alive and was a very good member of this body. And I will say that we did pass some extensions, all on a bipartisan fashion, as you will note, all on a bipartisan fashion. This was not done in a bipartisan fashion. We could have forged a bill that would have had overwhelming support in this House, in my opinion. The Republican side of the aisle chose not to do that. And I've got a hunch that my friend sitting in the chair, Mr. Schuster, regrets that. He doesn't have to say anything about that, but I just have a hunch he regrets that. I regret it. I regret it that we're not able to come together and reason together, but we take hard-line positions, and if you don't agree with me, it's my way or no highway. That's regrettable. The American people know it's regrettable. And I want to tell my friend from Pennsylvania, if it weren't 100 days ago, as of tomorrow, that a bipartisan, overwhelmingly bipartisan bill was passed, and if this House had been able to pass a real highway bill, but we didn't have that opportunity. That bill was not brought to the floor. The gentleman knows that bill was not brought to the floor. It still languishes in his committee, or perhaps reported out and maybe sitting someplace else. But the fact of the matter is, this motion is designed to say to 1.9 million people who may lose their job if we don't pass a bill next Friday, in a Congress that has been mired in confrontation and unwilling to compromise, and another million people who will have job opportunities if that bill passes. It is to say, let us act. And we have a vehicle on which to act, a vehicle that enjoyed the support of all Democrats and half of the Republican conference in the United States Senate. A bill that had the agreement between Senator Boxer from California, correctly I think described as a liberal Democrat from the state of California, and Jim Imhoff, correctly described, I believe, as a conservative Republican from Oklahoma. They came together. They reached agreement. I think the gentleman from Pennsylvania is probably absolutely correct. It's not a perfect bill. I don't know that I've ever voted for a perfect bill on the floor of this House, at least one that I thought was perfect. That's the nature of this body, that we come together and we compromise and everybody doesn't get what they want because maybe their region or their people or their businesses or their consumers don't see it the same way mine do. We compromise. But the Senate bill, while it may not be perfect, enjoyed broad, bipartisan compromise and support. Therefore, I think it is our best opportunity because we've shown in this House that we have for the last 6 months been unable to come to agreement. And the Republican majority in this House has been unable to agree among itself to bring a full bill to the floor. So, Mr. Speaker, that does not give much confidence, not only to not my side of the aisle, but to those contractors, those construction workers, those states, those counties, those municipalities who know that they have to address the transportation challenges of their areas. It doesn't give them much confidence. And I've heard a lot about building confidence. I believe that if we passed the Senate bill, we would create those jobs, retain the 1.9 million jobs, and give confidence to our economy and grow jobs. I hope that's what the other side wants to do. They talk a lot about it. And if the economy approved, of course, the administration might be advantaged as well. I hope that's not in the consideration of anybody that considers these pieces of legislation. America expects us to come together and reach agreement. The Senate's done that. On this side of the aisle, on this side of the Capitol, we have not. We ought to do it. I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman
I have no
reserves.
other speakers. If the gentleman, you yield back? Yield back. The gentleman yields back his time. I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields back. All time for debate has expired. Without objection, the previous question is ordered. The question on the motion to instruct those in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed say no. The opinion of the chair is the noes have it.
Mr. Speaker? Mr. Speaker, on that I ask for a recorded vote.
The gentleman asked for the yeas and nays. The yeas and nays are requested. Those favoring a vote on the yeas and nays will rise. Sufficient number having risen, the yeas and nays are ordered. Pursuant to Clause 8 of Rule 20, further proceedings on this question will be postponed. Purpose does the gentlewoman from Tennessee rise?
Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent that all members may have 5 legislative days in which to revise and extend their remarks and include extraneous material on the topic of my special order.
Without objection, it's ordered.
Mr. Speaker, I offer a motion to instruct.
The clerk will report the motion.
Motion to instruct conferees on H.R. 4348, offered by Mrs. Black of Tennessee. Mrs. Black of Tennessee moves that the managers on the part of the House at the conference on the disagreeing votes of the 2 houses on the Senate amendment to the bill H.R. 4348 be instructed to reject Section 31108 of the Senate amendment relating to distracted driving grants, other than the matter proposed to be inserted as Section 411G of Title 23 United States Code relating to a distracted driving study.
Pursuant to Clause 7 of Rule 22, the gentlewoman from Tennessee, Mrs. Black, and the gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Altmaier, will each control 30 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentlewoman from Tennessee.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And we began the 112th General Assembly of the Congress by reading the U.S. Constitution as a body. And we require that every bill cite the section of the Constitution that allows Congress to consider the legislation. My motion to instruct simply maintains this desire of the House by protecting states' rights under the 10th Amendment. The 10th Amendment reads, "The powers not delegated to the United States by the Constitution, nor prohibited by it to the states, are reserved to the states, respectively, or to the people." And I believe that the issue of laws related to distracted driving are best left to the states. That's why, as a state senator in my home state of Tennessee, I voted 3 times for distracted driving law on the books today. As a mother and a grandmother and a nurse, I strongly support absolute safety on our roadways. I also believe that there's no one in this chamber who doesn't support safe driving laws. But this motion to instruct is not about safety. It's about the states' rights under the Constitution and stopping federal manipulation of state law through taxpayer-funded distracted driving grants. Now, the Senate passed a highway bill, Senate Bill 1813, that contains a provision that would grant the U.S. Department of Transportation Secretary Ray LaHood $79 million to entice the states to enact and enforce federal distracted driving laws. Currently, something that 39 states already have on their books. 39 states have already enacted these laws. I believe the states are great laboratories for determining what works and what does not work. And that is why my motion is to instruct that keeps intact a study. I want the study to be conducted on all forms of distracted driving. This helps government and also the public better understand and identify the most effective methods to educate drivers and enhance states' understanding of these issues so that they can enact and tailor laws best suited to their individual needs of their states. I'm offering a motion to instruct that simply strikes the distracted driving grant funding language contained in the Senate-passed bill while calling for a study to be conducted on all forms of distracted driving. This helps government and the public better understand and identify the most effective methods to educate the drivers and enhance the state's understanding of these issues so that they can enact and tailor laws best suited to the individual needs of their state. What is best for the state of Massachusetts may not be best for the state of Montana, and as a 10th Amendment to our Constitution was written, these laws are reserved for individual states. Now, just as we must provide certainty to job creators, we must provide certainty to states on the highway bill. The only way to accomplish this task is to allow for a focused use of taxpayer dollars that is produced in a multi-year transportation bill that restricts the highway fund to its intended use, that is, building and maintaining Americans' roads and bridges. Taxpayer dollars are so precious, they should not be used on anything other than the intended purpose. I urge my colleagues to protect states' rights and support my motion to instruct. Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentlewoman reserves. The gentleman from Pennsylvania is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I rise in opposition to the motion. The motion offered by the gentlewoman from Tennessee, Ms. Black, seeks to eliminate a distracted driving grant program included in the Senate Surface Transportation Authorization Bill. I oppose this motion because it ignores the significant safety hazard that distracted driving poses to drivers, commuters, passengers, and pedestrians. Distracted driving is any activity behind the wheel that takes a driver's attention away from the road. The rapid development and ubiquitous use of technology such as cell phones, smartphones, and in-vehicle touchscreens has made routine distraction an almost commonplace occurrence in every vehicle across America. According to the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration, in 2010, more than 3,000 Americans were killed in crashes involving a distracted driver, and approximately 416,000 additional Americans were injured. Distractions from technology can include texting, talking on a phone, or using a navigation system or other audio or visual equipment while in the vehicle. But because text messaging requires visual, manual, and cognitive attention from the driver all at the same time, it is by far the most dangerous distraction. The Wireless Association reported that in June of 2011, more than 196 billion text messages were sent or received in the United States, which is up nearly 50% from just 2 years ago over the same period. The National Highway Traffic Safety Administration also reported that more than 100,000 drivers are texting and more than 600,000 drivers are using cell phones at any given moment in time. Sending or receiving a text takes a driver's attention from the road for an average of 4.6 seconds, which, while it may not seem like a long time, it's the equivalent of driving the length of an entire football field, taking the driver's eyes off the road. It's not surprising that, according to research done by Virginia Tech, a texting driver is 23 times more likely to be involved in a crash than a non-distracted driver. The proposed grant program in the Senate bill is an opportunity to address the rapidly growing problem of distracted driving and to educate the driving public about the real and immediate dangers of distraction behind the wheel. And, Mr. Speaker, thousands of American lives are at stake. And these are not statistics. These are people like 21-year-old Casey Feldon, who was struck and killed by a distracted driver as she crossed the street in Ocean City, New Jersey in 2009. It's people like 56-year-old John Slighting, who was killed on his motorcycle when a teen driver talking on her cell phone missed a stop sign in June 2007. It's people like 13-year-old Markey Amendment, who was killed on her school bus when a distracted driver rear-ended that bus in September of 2008. And although some on the other side of the aisle are skeptical of seemingly every federal program, we must avoid the temptation to eliminate programs without considering the real impacts they have on the lives of our constituents and on communities all across America. And to the point the gentlewoman, my friend from Tennessee, Ms. Black, raised in her opening remarks, the distracted driving grant program contained in the Senate bill is merely an incentive program, not mandatory. It's an incentive for states that have already passed laws and have them on the books. Therefore, there are no sanctions if states do not pass laws or participate. There are no penalties to not participate. So, Mr. Speaker, to put it simply, this motion represents a giant step backwards in highway safety for all of America. I urge my colleagues to reject this motion to instruct, and I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman reserves. The gentlewoman from Tennessee.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I'd like to yield 5 minutes to Mr. Bishop from Utah.
Gentleman from Utah is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the gentlelady from Tennessee. I guess I, as well as others, are here today to plead the 10th Amendment. You see, texting while driving is dangerous, and it should be stopped. Careless driving of any form is dangerous, and it should be stopped. And we should be grateful for every effort to educate our drivers as to the significance of this particular effort. But the question has to be, are the efforts only to be done in this particular body? A driver's license is a state certificate. Driving is a state privilege. And even though Congress has in the past overstepped our responsibility in involving ourselves in these areas, and that was wrong, that is certainly not justification for continuing that practice ever forward. The Commerce Clause does not necessarily expand to this area. The senators, in their wisdom, have included a provision in there dealing with this issue. It's a noble concept. It's a worthy goal. The approval or disapproval of texting while driving is not the issue. The issue is not should it happen. The issue is who at which level should decide if it happens and what the consequences should be. The issue is, are we the only ones who have the opportunity of breathing the air of the Potomac River, the only ones smart enough to be involved in this issue, the only ones compassionate enough to be in this issue? I would contend to you that those who are in our states are equally competent to handle this issue. It's been mentioned 39 states already outlaw texting, 10 outlaw any kind of handheld communication while driving, 32 states ban all sorts of these efforts with novice drivers. My state of Utah has moved forward in this particular area. And yet the Senate has now put in $79 million to incentivize states to do what they're already doing. We tried to pass a balanced budget amendment on this floor. It failed, and I felt sad about that. But I realized also we can't accomplish the exact same goals if we respect federalism, which of course was reinforced in the 10th Amendment. Federalism simply would require the federal government to concentrate on the core constitutional responsibilities given to us in that document, and allow the states the flexibility to solve the other problems. States do not have the kind of restrictions established in the Constitution that we have. States can be far more creative than a one-size-fits-all program from Washington. States can be much more effective in the way they run their programs. States can actually apply justice to unique circumstances within their state borders. It can never be accomplished by Washington. Our only ability is to make sure that everything is uniform. The states, we can accomplish the same goal if we respect the authority of states. $79 million is a high price to pay for the arrogance that only we here in Washington can do things well. The states are doing it. Not everything has to be ordained, funded, and controlled by those who sit on this floor. The states have every competence, every ability. We should support the 10th Amendment and recognize the states should do this. They will do a better job than we. And I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from Pennsylvania.
We have no further speakers. I would make the point to yield myself as much time as I may consume. The previous speaker talks about states being the innovators. I certainly agree on that. This motion that we are talking about right now involves a state incentive program where states can qualify for federal money for an optional grant that they may choose to participate in or not. If they do not choose to participate, they are free to pass any distracted driver laws they wish or not. There is nothing in what is contained in the Senate bill that in any way inhibits or prohibits or disincentivizes states from passing their own distracted driving laws. They are still free to do whatever they want to do and go as far or not as they want to go. All the Senate language says is that if states choose to meet the higher federal standards, they may qualify for potential limited grant money that will be made available. no state is sanctioned for not participating. So with that, I would continue to reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman reserves. The gentlelady from Tennessee.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And now I'd like to yield 5 minutes of my time to my good friend and colleague from Louisiana, Mr. Scalise.
Gentleman from Louisiana is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I want to thank the gentlelady from Tennessee for yielding time and also for bringing this amendment forward to instruct the conferees on the transportation bill. If you look at what the amendment, what the motion to instruct is saying, it's first of all, we recognize that 39 states have already put laws on the books to address problems with distracted drivers. It's a national problem, but every state, just as they have the right and the responsibility to create their own laws on issuing driver's licenses, each state has their own age requirements, their own speed limit requirements. Each state has to look at the unique problems that are posed by distracted drivers within that state. In fact, in our state of Louisiana, we have a ban on texting while driving, and the legislature has gone back and forth on other forms of whether or not you can use a cell phone with a Bluetooth or with a speaker in your car if it's enabled to do that. And so technology changes, and the local states have the ability to be flexible enough to change their laws accordingly how it best suits their state. And ultimately, by having the $79 million pot of money that would be up to the Secretary of Transportation to enforce, as it says, federal distracted driving laws, I think it gets away from the whole concept of the fact that states are the ones that are in charge of doing this, and the states know best what needs to happen in their states. Driving laws in Louisiana are a lot different than they are in California or New York or somewhere else. That's what the 10th Amendment's all about. That's why you have elected officials at the state and local level is to handle the problems that are unique to each area. And the fact that you've got a $79 million pot of money that would only be put into the discretion of the Secretary of Transportation just for this purpose, instead of using the $79 million to build roads throughout the countries, or to allow the states to do what they think is best to improve safety in other ways. There are many things that need to be done in each of our states to improve safety on the roads. And if a state's done a good job of addressing their texting problems and the distracted driving problems as it relates to cell phones and other things, somebody eating and sitting in their car, ultimately the states know best what to do, and if they've got more flexibility with the money, this isn't Washington's money, by the way, they're paying into it. Every citizen back home when they buy gasoline is paying taxes. This is their money. It's not the federal government's money to say $79 million is only available for the things that we think are most likely to increase safety, when the states know what's better. Local people on the ground, people paying those taxes know what's better to increase safety, and you're not allowing them to use that money for the things that actually would improve safety even more. And so by limiting this $79 million to a fund that the Secretary himself in Washington would give out, let's let the states have that money back, money that they've paid in already, and let them do what they know is best to increase safety, whether they think it's putting guardrails on roads where the guardrails have broken off and they don't have the money to put that back in place, or whether it's to put railroad crossings. We have so many deaths by people who cross railroads where there's no crossing. And yet it's very expensive to build those. States would like the ability to use the money to increase safety and stop the deaths that occur by spending it there. Yet this $79 million isn't allowed for that. Let the states do what they know best, because it's their money. It's the people's money. It's not Washington's money and some Washington bureaucrat who thinks he knows best how to handle a problem at a federal level that applies to all states when it works differently in every state. The challenges, the safety challenges that face our citizens are very different in each state, especially as it relates to driving on the road. So again, I want to thank the gentlelady for bringing this motion to instruct. I surely support the motion and also encourage everybody else in this chamber to support it, because ultimately, if you've got $79 million that can be much better used to increase safety in other ways, why would you want to cordon it off and only allow it to be used for one way when maybe 39 different states have 39 different ideas of how to do it better? Well, we can learn from them for once instead of trying to have this top-down approach where Washington knows best. I think it can be handled much differently, much better at the local level. At the end, it's their money anyway. So urge approval of this motion to instruct, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from Pennsylvania.
yielding myself as much time as I may consume, I would again make the point that the program in question in no way sanctions, penalizes, disincentivizes, discourages, or prohibits states from in any way addressing driver safety. It in no way prohibits states from being innovative, from creating new technologies, new programs, doing things that are not recommended in the bill or this program. States are free to do whatever they want to do on this issue. So to continually pound away at the point that we're somehow taking away the ability of states to be flexible is simply incorrect. It's not consistent with the program in question. It's not consistent with the language of the bill we are discussing. And with that, I would inquire to my friend, I have no more speakers on our side. Is she prepared to close?
I am.
Then, Mr. Speaker, I yield back the balance of my time and urge my colleagues to oppose the motion.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from Tennessee, recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'm going to yield myself as much time as I may consume.
Ladies.
This is a worthy goal. As I have already said, I'm a nurse, I'm a grandmother, I'm a mother. I want safety on our roads. I have served in the state legislative body where I have voted 3 times on distracted driving. We did our studies. We found what the problems were in the state of Tennessee. We were able to pass laws to make the roads safer. Careless driving of any form must be stopped. And I applaud the piece in the bill that will create more study so that states can have more information about just what they need to craft in their state that will be identified as distracted driving. Obviously, distracted driving does not just mean cell phones. It does not just mean texting. There are other forms of distracted driving. A mother turning around to correct her small child that's sitting in the back seat. I personally have seen those kinds of accidents. Someone reaching for a CD to put in their disc. I personally have seen the devastation from that action. There are many forms of distracted driving, and this study will help us and the states and the public to understand what those forms of distracted driving are. In my motion, that is left in place. Again, we have to be very cautious about our dollars and how it is that we hand our dollars out. And I talk about this almost as legislative candy, this $79 million to incentivize or entice states to do something, and 39 of them are already doing something related to distracted driving. As a matter of fact, if we take a look at this whole discussion on the transportation bill, we know how precious every dollar is. We're talking about infrastructure and creating jobs. This $79 million can be best used by its intended programs, and that is to build roads and bridges to make our roads safer so that we can make sure that our roads and our infrastructure are in the best shape. States are already doing this job. We don't need to take $79 million and hand it out to states by using a candy to get them to do what we want them to do. Absolutely, safety is the major issue, but states can make that decision. States have enough knowledge to know what's best for their states. And so, Mr. Speaker, I urge my colleagues to protect states' rights and support my motion to instruct. Thank you, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentlewoman yields back. All time for debate has expired. Without objection, the previous question is ordered. The question is on the motion to instruct. Those in favor say aye. Opposed say no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it.
Mr. Speaker,
The gentleman from Pennsylvania.
on that I ask for the yeas and nays.
The yeas and the nays are requested. Those favoring a vote by the yeas and the nays will rise. A sufficient number having risen, the yeas and nays are ordered. Pursuant to Clause 8 of Rule 20, further proceedings on this question will be postponed. Chair will entertain 1-minute request. From what purpose does the gentleman from Ohio rise?
Mr. Speaker, I request permission to address the House for 1 minute.
Without objection, the gentleman is recognized.
First Energy, which operates the Davis-Besse nuclear power plant, has consistently misrepresented to the public structural defects in the building that shields its reactor. Their latest fable is that cracks in the circumference of the shield building were caused by a snowstorm that occurred in 1978. In 2002, First Energy covered up information about a hole in the head of a reactor that jeopardized the safety of millions of people, for which they were fined $28 million. First Energy caused the blackout in August 2003, which put 50 million people in the dark because they were too cheap to hire people to trim trees. Can they be believed when they claim a snowstorm 34 years ago created cracks that appear today? Are buildings all over northern Ohio falling apart today because of the blizzard of '78? Or is this just another in a series of desperate lies used to keep a plant going that should be either shut down or massively repaired? How long before First Energy's 34-year snow job is fully exposed?
Are there further 1 minute? The chair lays before the House the following personal request.
Leaves of absence requested for Mr. Bishop of New York for today, Ms. Clark of New York for today, and Ms. Jackson Lee of Texas for today.
Without objection, the requests are granted. For what purpose does the gentleman from Ohio seek recognition?
I ask unanimous consent to claim the time of the yes. Pursuant to
Under the Speaker's announced policy, January the 5th, 2011, the gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Kucinich, is recognized for 60 minutes as the designee for the minority leader.
I thank the gentleman. I spoke here a minute ago on the floor of the House concerning my deep and abiding concern about a nuclear power plant in the state of Ohio called the Davis-Besse Nuclear Power Plant. Now, this power plant, when it was first licensed, has, from the time it was first licensed, has experienced a series of shutdowns, so much so that there was a period where the company that originally owned it, the companies that originally owned it, had massive losses because the plant was not up and running. Now, they had so many difficulties that it became an embarrassment to the nuclear industry itself. We are now at a point where this plant is trying to get a new license for its nuclear facility. Now, there are over 104 nuclear power plants in America. Some of them have achieved relicensing. Others are in the process of applying. One of the things that we have to be concerned about, because we are talking about nuclear power plants, is the structural stability of the plant, which includes the shield building and the reactor, that the structural stability of these plants is going to be assured. In the case of First Energy, they have a shield building, which there have been questions raised about its structural stability. Unfortunately, First Energy went out of its way to tell one story to the Nuclear Regulatory Commission and another story to the public. They told the public that the cracks that were seen in the shield building were not really substantive. But they told the Nuclear Regulatory Commission another story. And in understanding that we have a lack of candor on the part of a nuclear reactor permit holder here, we have to be very concerned about their public statements, about their private disclosures, and about the implications for relicensing. Now, these cracks in the shield building, which are in the circumference of the building, they're trying to say now, they're telling the Nuclear Regulatory Commission the reason these cracks occurred is because there was this blizzard in 1978 where the wind direction was, if I'm correct, primarily out of the southwest, that this is responsible for the cracks, but the cracks are around the whole building. They're not able to explain that. Nor do we know whether or not their sister reactors on the other side of Lake Erie at the Perry Nuclear Power Plant have in fact been adequately inspected to see if the same winter storm adversely affected them. Because if the winter storm did not adversely affect them at the Perry plant, then how is it that you had cracks only at Davis-Besse, and why were the cracks around the circumference of the building instead of just in the one area where the wind was driving the snow? In this company, First Energy, in 2002, covered up information about a hole in the head of their reactor. Now I want to ask my friend from Minnesota if he needs any of this time right now, because I can conclude. With the chair, Mr. Chairman, I'd yield to the gentleman from Minnesota.
The gentleman from Minnesota is recognized.
I want to thank the gentleman for claiming the time. I guess I was about 4 minutes behind. And, of course, you got to be on your toes around here. I had come prepared to do the special order.
Okay. What I'm going to shortly yield, ask unanimous consent that the gentleman from Minnesota would be able to have the balance of the time.
Well, if the gentleman from Ohio wants to you know, if you, we can share the time if you like.
What would be, I'd ask the parliamentarian, would it be possible for me to have unanimous consent to yield the remainder of my time to the gentleman from Minnesota?
The unanimous consent is not required.
Is that
under the Speaker's announced policy of January the 5th, 2011, the gentleman from Minnesota will control the remainder of the hour.
Okay, so I would just ask for a moment to conclude here. You know, why am I bringing this up about the Davis-Besse nuclear power plant? Some people would say, well, why shouldn't you give First Energy the benefit of the doubt? This is a company that 10 years ago covered up information about the hole in the head of a nuclear reactor. They were this close to having a breach, this close, fraction of an inch from having a breach of the reactor. They had files that were in a photo, and federal investigators weren't given access to that. It ended up where this company gets fined $28 million because they weren't candid with the government and could have put the people of Ohio and Michigan and Indiana and Canada and the water of Lake Erie in jeopardy. This is the same company. Many people remember, particularly in cities in the East, that time in August of 2003 where all the lights went out in the East. Remember, some people were sitting on their doorsteps for the first time, no city lights, looking up at the stars, but it wasn't particularly all that beautiful, because what was not beautiful is the fact that there was this massive loss of power all over America's East Coast that came about because of a series of technical glitches, the root cause of which was that this company, First Energy, wasn't properly trimming trees because they didn't want to hire the people to do it. Now, this is the same company that's telling us the reason why they have cracks in a shield building is because of a blizzard 34 years ago. Hello. We have to be very careful before we let a company that operates so fast and loose with the truth be in a position to have a license to continue to operate this nuclear power plant. And in the alternative, they are going to have to make massive repairs. And if they won't make the massive repairs, then the NRC ought to do the right thing for the American people and have this shut down. I do not want to see another Fukushima in the United States of America. I do not want to see the people in my district at risk. I do not want to see the people in Ohio put at risk, because you've got a company like First Energy operating in the shoddy way in which they operate, misrepresenting conditions to the public, telling the NRC one thing, the people the other. I can promise you, Mr. Speaker, I intend to stay on top of this. I appreciate the opportunity here, and I yield the remainder of the time to the gentleman from Minnesota, the co-chair of the Progressive Caucus of the Congress, a person who has done a lot to take the message of the Progressive Caucus across this nation in a way that's been very dynamic, the Honorable Keith Ellison.
And I thank the gentleman, and
Minnesota is recognized.
And I thank the Speaker. And as I was listening to the gentleman from Ohio recite the facts and the details of this energy situation, I couldn't help but think to myself that we need massive investment in public infrastructure in this nation. That it's not simply a jobs issue, though it is a jobs issue. It's also a public safety issue. You know, the gentleman talked about Fukushima. That was a catastrophic event. But if we don't take good care of our nation's infrastructure, catastrophe will occur, and I can testify to that because I'm from Minnesota, and in my state, only a few years ago, we saw our bridge fall into the Mississippi River, lost 13 Minnesotans lost their lives. 100 fell into the Mississippi River, 65 feet, suffered severe back and spinal injuries. Infrastructure, folks, is not simply a jobs issue. Infrastructure is not simply an economic issue. Infrastructure is also a public safety issue, and we need to make a demand that our government focus on infrastructure investment at this time. Mr. Speaker, I'm Keith Ellison. I'm the co-chair of the Progressive Caucus. I hope to be joined in this hour by other members of the Progressive Caucus. I think some members of the congressional, the CBC will be joining me as well to talk about the situation involving Attorney General Holder. But today, Mr. Speaker, we're the Progressive Caucus. We come with the progressive message. The progressive message is basically very simple, Mr. Speaker. It's the idea of liberty and justice for all. Mr. Speaker, you know that every morning we in Congress come down to the well, and we're very honored to say the Pledge of Allegiance. And the progressive message of the Progressive Caucus is basically embodied in that pledge. We pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. We're indivisible. Yes, it's true we have come in different colors. We come in different cultures. We come in different religious backgrounds. But we're one nation. And yes, it's true that it's liberty and justice for all. No exceptions. Everyone. Old, young, black, white, Latino, Asian, born in America, people who came here to immigrate, people of different religious backgrounds, people straight, gay. Americans are Americans are Americans, and they have the freedom to be who they are and have the liberty to pursue happiness as they define it and within the law and consistent with the rights of all others. But that's where it ends. This is the Progressive Caucus, and I'm here to talk about the progressive message. And, Mr. Speaker, our email is right down here at cpc@grijalva.house.gov. We encourage people to stay in touch with us, Mr. Speaker, because we like to hear what the people have to say, like to hear their insights, their views, their values, what they think is important. So we encourage people to stay in touch. That's cpc.grijalva.house.gov. This is the Progressive Caucus website. Now, Mr. Speaker, here we've been here another week in Congress, another week where we have serious problems going on, Mr. Speaker. Within a short period of time, I believe today's date is June 21st. Within 9 days, Mr. Speaker, July 1st, what we were going to see, Mr. Speaker, is interest rates on student loans double. We're going to see an expiration of our transportation bill. And do you think, Mr. Speaker, we took up either one of those issues on the House floor today or yesterday or any time since Monday, Mr. Speaker? Absolutely not. We urge the Republican majority to think about what's going on with the American middle class. Student loan rates to double on July 1. This could affect literally thousands and thousands of American students, and yet we're not acting on these issues at all. The Democrats have said, yes, absolutely. Progressives have said, yes, absolutely. We cannot let student loan rates double at a time when we see colleges all over America experiencing double-digit increases in tuition, when the price of an education has gone sky high, outpaced inflation manyfold. And now, on July, when Congress tried to fix it, we're going to let it go back to the bad old days and let student loan rates double, costing students perhaps as much as $1,000 a year. And then even though the Republican majority agreed with the Ryan budget, which said we should just let the students have to pay more, they then saw the light and came back and said, okay, we don't want the student loan rates to double either. But then, Mr. Speaker, what happens is that they say, but we want to take the money out of women's health. Of course, we couldn't agree to that. We can't set students versus women. We can't say we're going to help students, but we're going to take the money away from women under the Health Care Act and cervical screenings and such. Can't do that. That wouldn't be right. What if we asked the most wealthy members of our society, the richest Americans, to just do a little bit more so that students could have an affordable education. And our Republican friends said, no, never can we ask rich people to do a little bit more. And so now here we stand, Mr. Speaker, a few days, 9 days before student interest rates are about to double, and we saw no action on it on the floor this week. This is a horrible tragedy. This is a sad situation. You know, we lost 28,000 construction jobs last month. Congress still hasn't passed the highway bill. Highway bill is due to expire 10 days from now, 9 days from now, and our friends in the majority have not addressed this issue. This is a shame, it is a stain, and it's a disgrace. And if you hold the majority in the House of Representatives, you have to focus on the needs of the people. And I hope the people are paying attention today, Mr. Speaker, because all this week, those student loans are due to double. The student interest rate loans are due to double. Interest rates on student loans are due to double in 10 days. And the highway bill is due to expire in 10 days. But we have not touched these issues, these key issues on the House floor. And I'm just asking my Republican majority friends, why won't they pursue a jobs agenda instead of the no jobs agenda they've been pursuing? The President laid out a great jobs bill, and yet we haven't seen any action on it. Let's have a vote on it, Mr. Speaker, up or down. Is the Republican majority afraid of? Do they fear that there's a few Republicans who really believe that Americans need jobs who will join with all the Democrats and put America back to work? Put it on the floor. I think that the American people want to vote on jobs. So let me just say, Mr. Speaker, because I think it's so important we have to restate certain things. If you just tuned in, Mr. Speaker, student loan interest rates will double July 1 if Congress does nothing. This week, we did nothing. So the clock is ticking, and I am a little worried, Mr. Speaker. After losing 28,000 construction jobs last month, Congress hasn't passed a highway bill, and that bill is due to expire because the Republican majority won't pass a long-term transportation bill. This is a mistake. This is bad leadership, and the American people should know about it, Mr. Speaker. But, Mr. Speaker, I know you're thinking, well, what did we do? If we didn't take care of the issues that are so pressing, what did the Republican majority do this week? They must have done something because we were here. Well, I'll tell you what they did. We authorized the killing of sea lions in the Northwest. I don't think that's a key issue we need to focus on. We waived 39 environmental laws within 100 miles of the border. We waived, said don't worry about complying anymore, 39 environmental laws within 100 miles of the border. So if you're within 100 miles of the border, I guess clean air and clean water just happen. But of course, any 6-year-old kid knows that's not true. What else did we do? This area within 100 miles of the border where we waived 39 environmental laws, this includes areas in Minnesota where I'm from, like the Boundary Waters Wilderness or Voyageurs National Park. These are beautiful, pristine national treasures, and in my opinion, it's a shame to say that environmental laws would not apply there. Thank goodness these bills haven't been taken up by the Senate, because the Senate clearly knows that this is bad policy, but it didn't stop the Republican majority from pushing it, because the Republican majority believes that all problems will be fixed if we don't regulate industry and if we cut taxes on the very well-to-do. They're mistaken about that, but that's what they believe. And I give them credit for saying it all the time, because it gives the American people a chance to know what choices they have in front of them. What else did we do, Mr. Speaker? We required federal agencies to give oil companies 25% of all public lands they nominate for drilling. I'm going to say that one again. The House Republican majority required federal agencies to give oil companies 25% of all public lands. That's our lands, my lands, your lands, Mr. Speaker. They nominate for drilling. So they used to say drill, baby, drill, drill, baby, drill. They're not kidding about that. Even after the oil spill in the Gulf, it hadn't slowed them down. They still are on this thing about letting drilling happen whenever, however, whatever they want. I think that there ought to be some public lands that are pristine and nice for the American people, and yet the Republican majority passed a provision that required federal agencies to give oil companies 25% of all public lands they nominate for drilling. Now, if you think about that, Mr. Speaker, think about this. Regardless of the natural beauty, regardless of the environmental harm, regardless of the fishing or hunting damage, we would mandate that big oil gets 1/4 of whatever it wants. That's bad policy. But yet, that was what was passed on the House floor this week. What else did the Republican majority do this week? Just so the American people know. We weakened the Clean Air Act protections. We require the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, to elevate cost concerns above all others. So are you noticing a theme? The Republicans like to say we have an all-the-above strategy for energy. They say we have an we want oil, we want wind, we want biomass, we want all this. But if you look at what they actually put on the floor and voted through with the Republican majority, they don't have a all-the-above strategy. They have oil above all strategy. Oil above all. There's a theme here. This oil above all strategy was quite unfortunate. This Congress can do better. We should be taking action now, not delaying till it's too late. And I just want to say, Mr. Speaker, this week, as we all are concerned about student loan interest rates doubling on July 1st, and we're all concerned about the expiration of the highway bill, knowing that workers will be laid off if that happens, it's a shame we didn't address these critical issues facing the American people, but instead spend our time deconstructing environmental and health protections for the American people. I'm disappointed about that, but that is what we did. And I think the American people have a right to know about it, so, Mr. Speaker, I'm going to tell them about it. But I'd like to talk a little bit about what we've been doing, not just this week, as I just have, but talk a little bit more globally about what we've been doing this whole 112th Congress. Because there is a theme, undeniable, that we have been pursuing. There's a theme that we've been working on. And again, it is cut taxes for the wealthy, leave taxes for the middle class, and cut regulation for industry. Cut important environmental and health protections so that industry can keep more of the money so they don't have to spend it on making sure the air is clean and the water is clean. I'd like to talk a little bit about America's energy future because that has been a theme on the floor. We've been fighting up and down. But I want to say, and I mentioned I want to talk about the whole 112th Congress, because even though that has been a recurring Republican theme, if you ask the American people what they want us to talk about, what you'll see on this chart, Mr. Speaker, is a question. And the question is simple. It simply says, do you think the government should be doing more to help improve the financial situation of middle-class Americans? Should it be doing less, or do you think the government is doing the right amount to help improve the financial situation of middle-class Americans? So just to put the question out there again, Mr. Speaker, because, you know, I kind of went by quickly and this type is kind of small. Do you think the government should be doing more to help improve the financial situation of middle-class Americans? Should it be doing less, or do you think the government is doing the right amount to help improve the financial situation of the middle-class Americans? Well, this poll, pretty recent, right back in April, only a few weeks ago, and what Americans have said, Mr. Speaker, 67% of them said do more. 2/3 said do more. So they don't think the government is doing enough to help improve the financial situation of the middle class. And you know what, Mr. Speaker, they're right, because the American people know that if we were to pass a highway bill, that would help the middle class. If we would help college affordability, that would help the middle class. If we would do things like invest in our nation's infrastructure altogether, that would help the middle class. If we would stop selling off public lands, that would help the middle class. If we would help make sure there were sane and sensible and reasonable environmental protections like there are, but the Republicans want to get rid of, that would help the middle class. But the Republican majority their argument is that the government should do less. Now, they say smaller government, lower taxes, smaller government. They say this all the time. They say it so much that I can, like, repeat their mantras in my sleep. They are great at repetition. But the American people say the government should be doing more to help improve the financial situation of middle-class Americans. Two-thirds of them think so. So as we can't pass the Buffett rule, we can't get we can't do anything about student interest rates. We're letting the highway bill expire. Two-thirds of Americans think we should not be doing that. We should be doing more, not less. So those people who talk about smaller government, all that stuff, they're not where the American people are. 15% said do less. That must be the Koch brothers or something like that. And 14% say do the right amount. So about 29% say do less or do nothing more, and 3% said they didn't know. Two-thirds said the government should be doing more. And they're right. They're right. The government should be doing more. So that's why I want that point to be in front as I discuss this issue of America's energy future. We talked about energy today, and I want to discuss that a little bit more. We need an energy plan, Mr. Speaker, that puts the interests of the American people ahead of the interests of big oil. Republicans say they want all the above approach to energy. They say that all the time. Again, I credit them for being able to repeat the same theme over and over again. Great discipline on their part. But the only thing they presented as an oil above all approach, oil above all else, oil above wind, oil above biomass, oil above solar, oil above anything. And they've proven that that is their belief by the bills that we were dealing with this week. We should never mistake the interests of big oil and the polluters for the interests of the American people. We should always understand that oil is one way to power our country, and for the time being, it's going to be a part of our energy portfolio, but we should not be giving them massive subsidies. We should not be giving them massive subsidies when they're making record profits. We should not relieve them of basic health and safety protections to make sure that our natural wonders don't get destroyed, our wildlife doesn't get destroyed, our recreational industries don't get destroyed. The oil spill in the Gulf is still fresh in my mind. And I'm outraged, Mr. Speaker, that BP was able to write off the cost of the cleanup. I don't think enough Americans know that BP was allowed to write off the cost of the cleanup of the Gulf. In other words, they simply foisted that cost on the American people, which I think is terribly unfortunate. So this week, the Republicans brought an energy bill to the floor that simply checks off from big oil's wish list. To me, it felt like if big oil was to have a big wish list, the Republicans just played Santa Claus. And I don't think that's the right thing to do. I think what we should do is recognize the fact that petroleum will be a part of our energy portfolio, but we should minimize it. We should promote other sources, green sources of energy, wind, solar, biomass, conservation. We should be investing in innovative approaches, not just subsidizing the fossil fuel industry as we do to the tune of about $110 billion every 10 years. So as I said, Mr. Speaker, this week Republicans brought an energy bill to the floor that simply checks off from big oil's wish list. It weakens public health protections. It forces arbitrary giveaways of public land As I already mentioned, it puts energy drilling ahead of all other uses of federal land. The oil, gas, and coal industries are already getting billions in corporate welfare. They will receive at least $110 billion in subsidies over the next 10 years. These subsidies have been won by decades of lobbying. Lobbying. These subsidies have not been won because what they're asking Congress to do is such a great idea. They've had high-paid lobbyists come down here and work over members of Congress to give them what they wanted. And it has accumulated to the tune of about $110 billion a year. So they have a lot of power around here. But I think that we would not be serving the public properly if we just turned over public land so they can drill in them and spill in them and make all these mistakes that we ultimately have to pay for because they have won themselves tax breaks which allow them to write off the cost of these spills. In 2011, the oil, gas, and coal industry spent $167 million lobbying the federal government. $167 million paid to lobbyists by the oil, gas, and coal industry. Now, why, if they're right, do they have to spend so much money trying to convince Congress that they're so right? I mean, if you got a good idea, we would be able to review the bill and vote your way if you're got something in the interest of the American people. But if you have something that's for the special interests, well, yeah, you know, you got to pull out the guys in the monogram shirts and the $1,500 suits to come tell us why we got to give them this this loophole, which they, by the way, Mr. Speaker, always promise will bring jobs, but rarely does anything but bring them a lot more profit. But you know what, Mr. Speaker, the renewable energy industry also needs investment, not just the oil industry, which doesn't need it. Clean energy is the fastest growing job sector in the world. America should be leading, not getting left behind. As the world is investing in new energy production methods, America is investing in putting subsidies on fossil fuels. Now, from a scientific point of view, Mr. Speaker, we call the oil, coal, and gas industries fossil fuels. Why? Because these fuels are basically derived from just hundreds of millions of years worth of time going by and organic matter, trees from 1 million years ago and so forth. This is what is made, this is what fossil fuel is made from. But I think there's another good reason to call oil, gas, and coal fossil fuels. It's because they're the old way of doing stuff. We need some new ways of doing stuff. We need to invest in clean energy. If we want to stay the strongest economy in the world, we need to invest in industries growing the fastest. Experts say that investing in clean energy gets more bang for the buck, Mr. Speaker, in creating jobs in the fossil fuel industry. China has surpassed the United States in clean energy investment. China has surpassed the United States in clean energy investment, spending almost twice as much as we do, and the UK and Spain are not far behind. Analysts believe that the developing new clean energy techniques like wind and solar could support 20 million jobs by 2030 and trillions of dollars in revenue. And yet this week, on this energy bill we were dealing with, that was not what we were talking about. On the land bill we dealt with, that's not what we were talking about. We were giving more and more to those who already have too much in an old industry when we need to, yes, recognize that oil is going to be part of our energy portfolio, but it shouldn't dominate it. And we need to invest in new energy where the job growth centers are. Investing in clean energy creates 3 times as many jobs and more opportunities in every pay grade than traditional energy jobs. Yet we're subsidizing the fossil fuel industry 6 times the rate of supporting the renewable energy industry. I offer a simple amendment. I offered the last week, Mr. Speaker, I went to the Rules Committee, I had my amendment, and I offered a simple amendment to the Republican energy bill. It was a common sense piece that was ruled out of order, and when I saw some of the things that were ruled in order, I was shocked. all my amendment said that was ruled out of order and we weren't allowed to debate on the floor is it is the sense of the Congress that the fossil fuel subsidies should be reduced to help control the budget deficit. Now, my friends in the Republican majority are famous for harping on the deficit and the debt. They always talk about our children and our grandchildren. I don't know where they came up with that phrase, but it's remarkable to me that you can get all them politicians to say exactly the same thing all the time. Not saying that there was some study group or poll. I'm just saying it's a remarkable coincidence. My point is, though, you would think that if I said, hey, look, let's have the $110 billion we give every 10 years to the fossil fuel industry, let's let that be part of deficit reduction, you would think that my deficit hawk friends would be all over that. But unfortunately, we weren't even allowed to debate that because, of course, that might put some people on the hot seat. We all wanted to reduce America's deficit, the Progressive Caucus included, but we want to do it in a way that promotes green jobs, reduces our dependency on fossil fuels and hydrocarbon fuels, and increases conservation and green energy. But by maintaining these subsidies, it increases the deficit by $110 billion every 10 years. I hope my colleagues on the other side of the aisle, especially the fiscal conservatives, agree that $110 billion in fossil fuel subsidies is profitable to profitable companies doesn't make any sense. We need a true all-the-above strategy, as President Obama has said, that invests in clean, renewable energy, not this oil above all bill that we saw this week. Very sad and unfortunate. Mr. Speaker, I'd now like to turn our attention to another issue which I think is really important and really we need to focus some attention on. And that is the issue of Attorney General Holder. Today, Republicans on the House Oversight and Government Reform Committee voted to hold Attorney General Holder in contempt of Congress. This was a sad occasion because Attorney General Holder is a great American and deserved better treatment than he got from the Republican majority House Oversight and Government Reform Committee. Along with all Americans, I certainly mourn the loss of the Customs and Border Protection agent Brian Terry. Mr. Terry was a public servant who deserved to live his life, and it is a horrible shame that he was killed in a gunfight in Arizona, December 2010. We all agree that the gun walking policy, which was a policy started in the Bush administration and that allowed thousands of guns to be bought by weapons traffickers, should be investigated. This program has no signs of merit that I can see, and it's too bad. But here's the thing. This is why it's unfair to hold Attorney General Holder in contempt. As soon as he learned of the tactic, this gun-walking thing, Attorney General Holder condemned the tactic and ordered the Inspector General to investigate. And since then, he's testified before Congress 7 times and provided more than 6,000 pages of documentation as asked for. At this point, the Government Reform and Oversight Committee was demanding a document, and the executive, as is the tradition, and every executive said, documents that talk that are basically our conversations between a client and a lawyer, and basically our deliberative documents are not the proper stuff for disclosure. And the President asserted executive privilege, and what happens then is the Attorney General gets hit with a contempt of Congress. Instead of working in good faith to investigate what went wrong, it appears that Republicans on the committee, and maybe next week on the House floor, have used this strategy for political gain. Even after Attorney General Holder provided 6,000 pages of documents to Congress, House Republicans subpoenaed highly sensitive documents, including photographs of crime scenes and reports on a confidential informants, in order to score partisan political points. This is a misuse of the gavel. And last week, they withheld funding for our nation's law enforcement operations in retaliation. We should not withhold funding from our nation's law enforcement operations simply to score political points. This is a mistake. It is wrong. And I just hope, Mr. Speaker, that there's no one in need of law enforcement resources that doesn't get them because of this spat that the chair of the Oversight Committee has going on with Attorney General Holder. It's letting, there's an African proverb, Mr. Speaker, that I think you might appreciate, and it says, when the elephants fight, only the grass gets trampled. And so when the chair of the Oversight Committee wants to fight with the Attorney General, only regular people who need law enforcement resources suffer. And so I'm sad that that happened, and I hope today that we can abandon this time of witch hunts. Last time, the Republicans went after President Clinton a few years ago. It didn't help them. They impeached him but couldn't convict him. Took up a lot of time. We clearly were not able to focus on the needs of the country. And I hope that they learn a lesson and refocus on things like interest rates on student loans that are getting ready to go up and the transportation bill. These are things we need to focus on, not this political stuff they're trying to use to position themselves for the election. That's all I want to say about that for now, Mr. Speaker. You know, I want to talk a little bit also, to change the subject, Mr. Speaker, about money in politics. The Progressive Caucus passed a resolution to support something called Resolution Week. And this is when municipalities, city councils all over across America passed resolutions asking Congress to initiate a process to overturn Citizens United versus the Federal Elections Commission. Now, the Citizens United versus the Federal Elections Commission basically came to the conclusion that money was speech and corporations were people. Corporations are not people. They don't, I've never seen a corporation put on a uniform and go to war. They've been contractors, but they aren't people who go risk their lives. They don't have children. They don't raise families. Corporations don't die. They have limited liability, and basically a corporation is designed to do one thing and one thing only, make money for its owners. And yet, the Supreme Court said that corporations are as a person, and persons have the right to freedom of speech, and so any money they want to put on any campaign they can. And what this has done is really turned our elections into auctions, and the highest bidder wins. Now, this is a shame. We need to overturn Citizens United, but the Progressive Caucus was honored to be part of Resolutions Week when we saw officials passing resolutions across American cities asking Congress to overturn Citizens United. If we're going to get a constitutional amendment overturning Citizens United, we need an awesome public display, awesome amount of the community rising up and demanding that this happen. Last week we saw cities do it. I'm proud that my city of Minneapolis, very honored that Minneapolis passed a resolution calling for the overturn of Citizens United. Also honored that the city of St. Paul passed a resolution to overturn Citizens United. Honored that Duluth, Minnesota did so several months ago. Also, New York, Los Angeles, Chicago is considering a bill, and there are many, 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 many more. Over 1,600 elected public officials, both local, county, state, and federal, have joined together that said this is bad legislation. And I was very honored that the Progressive Caucus was a part of it. By organizing from the ground up, we can restore democracy to the people, for the people, and by the people. And several members of Congress have already introduced constitutional amendments to overturn Citizens United. Now, Mr. Speaker, as you may know, the traditional method to get a constitutional amendment, and again, there are now 27 constitutional amendments. We need one more to overturn Citizens United. Congress will pass something and then send it to the states, and then 2/3 of the states need to pass it, and then the president sign it, and then it's changed. The process, however, needs to be well supported by the public. And so we have tried to start this grassroots movement, joining with other leaders like Move to Amend and others, to see Citizens United overturned. We have several members, as many as 12 members of Congress, have introduced bills to have an overturning of the Citizens United, and I was very honored that we are partnering with city officials who are the closest unit of government to the people. Very honored to represent 12 cities in my own district, all great public servants there, and hope that we can work together to say that money should not overwhelm the political process. Mr. Speaker, one city official said, look, you know, people may think this is some big national issue, but think about this. If a wealthy individual wants to have a development in a particular part of town where the city council, the elected city council says, you know what, this is zoned for parks or residential or whatever, it's not appropriate to go here, a wealthy individual could simply dump as much money as they want to in a city race to the opponent and give money to the opponent of the people opposing this project and then basically buy off the city council. So this is something that local officials are correctly concerned about. The bottom line, though, is that we've got to move forward, and I'm proud that the Progressive Caucus is part of this effort. And so this work we did last week, I thought was great. The Progressive Caucus has come up with an important declaration. Since we have all these constitutional amendment proposals, over 14 of them, I think it was 12 of them, we had to come in unity some kind of way, and what we decided to do is this: all join on a declaration. And the declaration says this, Mr. Speaker: we declare our support for amending the Constitution of the United States to restore the rights of the American people undermined by Citizens United in related cases, to protect the integrity of our elections and limit the corrosive influence of money in our democratic process. And so that's what the declaration says. Over 1,600 elected officials, 2 state legislatures, more than 150 cities and towns, all calling for repeal and overturning of Citizens United. And if I could make just an example, we've seen outside spending on campaigns up 1,600% since Citizens United came in. Up 1,600% since Citizens United. And quite frankly, it's really something, it's gone crazy, and we got to do something about it. But I think it's important. You might be thinking, Mr. Speaker, well, what do we do between now and when we pass the constitutional amendment? One thing we could do today is we could pass the Disclose Act. This is a piece of legislation by Representative Chris Van Hollen, very dynamic leader, a gentleman from Maryland, and it requires public reporting of corporate campaign activity so that you can't have secret money. Right now, you could have a situation where some billionaire takes their personal money, dumps it into a super PAC, and then the super PAC spends the money. We don't even know who that person is spending the money. So under the Disclose Act, we'd find out the identity of some of these people. So we could do that right now. And by the way, some of the money we see creeping into American elections very well could be money from foreign sources. Senator McCain very correctly pointed out that there's one wealthy individual who has been putting a lot of money into election campaigns and is a billionaire and owns a casino in China and he's using his wealth to influence American elections. So that's foreign money, if that's the way it is. So the thing is that we do not want people outside the United States trying to shape the elections in our country. And so this is the thing that we're moving forward. Overturn Citizens United, amend and disclose. Amend the Constitution and disclose secret donors. And I close on this, Mr. Speaker. I close this section on this point. Corporations are not people, and in America, democracy should never, ever be for sale. Mr. Speaker, how much time do I have?
Gentleman has 11 minutes remaining.
With these last 11 minutes, I would like to take just a few minutes to talk about this college loan issue